Thank you very much, everyone, coming along today in this session. And I'll start with some housekeeping. Q&A questions, I think, put them on spot card in the live discussion section. Helps us keep track of everything. So today, this session, we've got James Fodor, talking to us about the history and challenges of economic development. James is a PhD student in the Decision, Risk and Financial Sciences program, completed graduate studies in physics and economics at the University of Melbourne, and has a master's degree in neuroscience at the Australian National University. He's also, as some of you may be aware, one of the lead organisers of the conference this year. So please join me in welcoming James.
Morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. I hope you'll find this talk interesting. So I have put together a brief introduction to economic growth and development, which is a huge area. So hopefully you'll find some things that are maybe things you haven't thought about before or a new perspective on things. So we'll see how we go. So let me first start by introducing the what I'm calling the paradox of growth, or people have given it different names. So you can kind of get a sense of it just by looking at this map here. This is a map of the countries in the world by GDP per capita. GDP stands for gross domestic product. It's the standard measure of the level of wealth or income or productivity of a region or a country in a given year. And per capita means per person. So obviously you want to adjust for the number of people in a country. It's not quite the same as the standard of living in a country, but there is a very high correlation. There are certain cases where one has to be cautious, like, for example, if the nation derives a large portion of its income from oil exports, as we see from some examples in the Middle East, there can be some issues with this statistic, but generally it's a pretty good measure of how productive a country is and how well its economy is working and the resources it has available for its citizens. So a question here is, why do we observe such a massive difference in levels of GDP per capita across the world? The difference between the very poorest countries, some of the countries in Central Africa in particular, and the very richest countries in Northeastern Europe and the US is about a factor of 100, which is enormous and somewhat hard to understand. Most of the reasons for higher productivity are ultimately due to improved technology and better processes for manufacturing and providing services. And in some sense, I mean, when we know how to do these, why can't we do them in other places? There's sort of money being left on the table here, so to speak. There's the idea that people don't want to be poor. Even dictators of poor countries would like their countries to be richer generally. So there's sort of an issue here as to what's going on here. Why is it? One economist phrased it, why isn't the whole world developed? Why do we have this massive difference here? And so that's the sort of question that I want to consider today. If we take a look at the next slide here, I also want to emphasize that although a lot of these considerations get a bit abstract, there is a very human side to this. And this is just a nice graphic that I found from the website Gapminder. If anyone has come across it, I recommend taking a look at it. They've got a page or a section called Dollar Street. You can see kind of this graphic there if you want to look that up. This is an illustration. What they have there is individual families from different countries around the world at different levels of income, adjusted so that it's comparable. And they take photos of different things like method of transportation and method of water access and food and things like that. So it gives you a more qualitative understanding of what different levels of income look like around the world. And the difference is enormous between people who live on $30 or $40 per month per adult to people who live on $3,000 or $4,000 per month per adult. And by the way, if you're interested in looking at this website, if you know what your income is per person in Australian dollars, if you divide that by about 20, I think that gives you roughly the per month equivalent figures if you're interested in making a comparison, because it's not directly comparable to Australian dollars. Anyway, yes, so let's move on to the next slide. So this is the question here, why is the whole world developed? Why such a massive difference in levels of income? We can break this question down a bit by first thinking about what is the process of economic growth or development? What is it that we're trying to understand more in a descriptive sense before we ask the question as like why it's happened in some places and not others. Not surprisingly, there's many frameworks that one can look at this through. I've chosen to present one here, which I think is quite helpful, and this is quite an influential one in the literature, Rostow's stages of growth. Now, the important thing to remember is that, in some sense, poverty is the default status of humanity, and he calls that he describes that in terms of a traditional society. Prior to roughly the late 18th century, essentially every country everywhere was what we're calling here traditional society, and would, by today's standards, be very poor, underdeveloped. So traditional societies have certain characteristics, such as transportation and communications are very difficult and expensive. The government is usually not very effective. There's limited economic integration and limited opportunities for producing goods and services at scale and using more capital and labor and things like that. So Roscoe discussed how we go from a traditional society to what he calls the age of mass consumption, which is a little bit of a pretentious title for just being a developed, wealthy country. But there's a couple of stages that he identified. So one of them, the first one is sort of what he called preconditions for takeoff. Takeoff, he's talking about the process of growth. I'll explain that a little bit in a moment. But by preconditions, he means that there's a certain set of factors that are necessary, or at least seem to be very helpful for starting this process, going from being a traditional society to kind of on the verge of the next stage. We might talk more about this when I talk about institutions a bit at the end, but he identifies certain things such as the emergence of more, this is particularly a historical analysis, but he talks about the emergence of, say, larger commercial agriculture in the United Kingdom, investment in United Kingdom being the first country to industrialize, so he focused on that, investment in better, like navigable, improved navigation of rivers and road systems, more effective methods of taxation and governance, and improved institutions for trade and finance and things like that. So these sort of things he argues set the preconditions for takeoff, and he sort of identifies that with industrialization. So the takeoff process here involves relatively rapid, so over the process of decades, transfer from most of the population working in agriculture, which is what is the case in a traditional society. Usually 80 to 90% of the population would work in agriculture. Many people work in subsistence agriculture, meaning they produce goods mostly for their own consumption and not for sale on a market. During the takeoff phase, many people move from agriculture into working in industry. So there's a massive change from a rural-based society to an urban-based society, and from an agricultural-based society to an industrial society. And those who stay in agriculture increasingly are selling more and more of their produce on the market, which is necessary to support the urban population because they need to buy food, right? So there's a process of overall structural change of the economy from subsistence agriculture focused to sort of commercial agriculture plus urbanized industrialization. And this goes along with changes to transportation and other types of institutions as well, which we'll talk about. So massive changes to government and the way that society works. And the drive to maturity is the next stage that he talks about, is a kind of process of widening. So often the takeoff process happens in a few industries initially. In the case of the UK, it was focused in things like in things like textiles and railway industry and mining, initially in sort of the late 18th, early 19th centuries. But over in the decades after that, it sort of widens to encompass more of the economy, and more of the economy kind of modernizes and adapts to new processes. We see larger firms in traditional societies. It's very rare to have firms that employ anyone outside the family beyond perhaps a few apprentices or something. Large firms and large institutions are very difficult to govern and manage, and so we see that's seen very rarely. As the economy matures, we see much more of that. Now, this sort of analysis is a bit historically focused, but I think it's still relevant to understanding processes that are occurring today in developing countries. For example, we still see in the very poorest countries, many people engaged in subsistence agriculture. We see in countries that are slightly more developed, more people moving into, well, urbanization, first of all, but also more people moving into working for larger firms. But often in many sort of middle-income countries, there's this sort of there's this dual economy where you have some larger modern firms that are producing using more efficient modern techniques and machinery and so forth, and also a very large sector of smaller traditional firms which are often much less efficient. And there's sort of various bottlenecks in terms of transitioning more people towards working for the larger firms, which can pay higher wages. But anyway, that's sort of a bit of a description as to what the process looks like. And I think it's important to bear in mind that economic development is not just a process of getting richer, it's a process of a fundamental structural change for the economy and society as a whole. And we have some idea of what those stages look like. Obviously, there's variations in each country, but there are often a lot of commonalities as well. Now, there's another aspect to the story of growth that I want to talk about. Oh, I don't have all my, okay, you just click through the next couple. Yeah, there we go. which is I've sort of described as how it happens here. The Rostow's stages of growth is sort of the descriptive what, and this is a bit more about the analytic side of how the process occurs. And this is more of a mathematical model, which I won't get into the details of, but it provides a key insight that I think is relevant here, the Solo model of growth. So the idea here is that it models growth, economic development, as a process of accumulating physical and human capital. So physical capital is thought of as things like, well, physical capital is things like machinery, factories, railways, stuff like that. So, you know, physically embodied processes of production. And the idea is that in order to work more efficiently, you need more and more physical capital. So we can see this very clearly with the Industrial Revolution, that first we develop more efficient pumps, essentially, that allow us to mine better and higher quality and more ore, which allows us to build more efficient steam engines and also makes that sort of viable. That allows us to develop more faster automation for spinning textiles, which lowers the cost of that, and that prompts, you know, development in shipping because there's a high demand for wool. So developments in some industries that allow production at a higher scale and higher intensity, then prompts developments in other industries, and they sort of feed off each other. But all of this requires high levels of physical capital, which allows the same amount of people to do much more work. But that takes time because you can't just have everything at once. It's an iterative process. You sort of earn some return, or you can borrow some money, and then you'll build the next version of a machine, or you buy that, and then you'll earn some profits, or at least convince people that you're going to earn profits, and then you can build the next version and so forth. And so this is the process of capital accumulation. It occurs for physical capital, but also human capital. So human capital is intangible skills and knowledge and experience. So this is developed both through on-the-job training and learning and research and development, and also through formal education. Traditional societies had extremely low levels of both physical and human capital. So most people were illiterate and had very little formal training of any sort. You know, there were some apprentices and people with certain trade skills, but for the most of the population worked either in agriculture or some unskilled labor, some portion of unskilled laborers. And the level of physical capital accumulation is extremely low as well. So the process of growth is modeled here as a process of capital accumulation. And here's an important point that I wanted to emphasize, is that in this model, growth slows down over time. So there is this idea of diminishing returns. It's a bit abstract, but you can sort of think of it in concrete terms as when a firm gets some money to invest, they will invest that generally, not always, but sort of in general terms, they'll invest that in whatever is the process that will earn them the greatest return, save the most amount of time you can think of, or improve their processes the most. So that's what they do with their first loan or their first profits that they've earned. But then if they get some more, well, then they'll use it for the next most effective thing. And the idea is that over time, at least in an aggregate sense for the economy as a whole, additional capital accumulation becomes less and less productive. It still increases productivity. It still improves the overall efficiency of the economy, but it's sort of diminishing less and less, at least for any point in time. So there's this idea here that at some point, the economy will slow down and reach an equilibrium point, which is sort of marked here. And this actually can increase over time with technological development. But I won't go into the details of that. The basic point I wanted to make is what we would expect to see with this model is there's this prediction of convergence. So actually, this model predicts that poor countries would grow faster than rich countries because there's higher returns to capital there. The idea is that if countries have very little capital, then there should be very high returns to earn there because they have so little of it. There should be really essentially low-hanging fruit to earn to be earned there. That's actually a reason why so many of the goods that we buy are produced in countries that are not as wealthy as Australia, effectively, because they have much lower levels of physical capital. So the returns to capital are higher there. So there's been a lot of investment in industry there in recent decades. But anyway, there's more to that issue, but I'm just trying to emphasize the point. So there's a prediction here of convergence and that countries will slow down in growth over time. And we sort of see this, but only in some cases. So this particular graph shows us different US states from 1880 to 1990. And we see a pretty good fit there. What we're seeing here is the growth rate on the vertical axis and the 1880 level of per person income on the horizontal axis. So there's a negative relationship there. Basically, the richer they started, the less they grew in that intervening time, which is exactly what you predict by this sort of diminishing returns model. But you may have noticed that we've called this conditional convergence and that's why I'm showing you a graph of US states and not just all countries. Because if you plot this for all countries, you don't see anything like this. And so this raises the question as to why is it only conditional convergence? Conditional in the sense that if you look at a certain subset, like US states, you see this, or European Union member states, you see this as well. It seems like that if you control for certain factors, for certain variables, and have a relatively similar set of states or regions or countries or something, then you see this convergence process. And so in other words, that means we kind of understand what's going on. There's gradual capital accumulation, and that fosters development. But we don't see that in all cases. So kind of what's going on there? Why is it, and I've raised this as a question, what are the barriers to growth? And this brings us back to the initial question, why isn't the whole world developed? Why haven't we already seen this process happen? We've seen it happen in some countries, but not others. So sort of what's the difference there? And this brings me to look at a few different proposals for basically what is this sort of key factor or the key reasons why we have growth in some regions or some countries but not in others. So I'm just going to briefly talk about a few sort of proposals. Let's take a look at the first with the next slide, and just put the dot points up. So I won't be able to do any of these justice, but sorry, there should be 4. That's not the best with this setup, but it's fine. So these are all different models or ideas that have been discussed in the literature at different times. So this I'm calling dependency theory, although you can describe it in different ways. But this is an idea that you particularly encounter if you study sort of human geography or political science or areas like that. This is an idea of exploitation. So the idea here is that the world is divided into different types of countries. There's an idea of the core countries, which is effectively the rich industrialized countries, and peripheral countries, which are countries in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa and so forth. And the idea is that the global economic institutions, such as the trade laws and conditions set by the World Bank for loans and things like that, benefit the wealthy nations. And also that the idea is that this is a system that was set up during colonialism in the late 19th, early 20th century. Formal colonialism doesn't exist anymore, but it's sort of been perpetuated on afterwards through institutions and through global institutions and other norms that have been enforced at the global level. An example is the idea that free trade, so liberalized international trade, benefits the core essentially because it prevents the periphery from industrializing, kind of traps them into producing relatively, you can see the graph here. The idea is that the resources like raw materials go from the periphery to the core, and produced goods go from the core to the periphery. So this is an idea that people do argue for, and if we look at the next slide, next slide, please. It's fundamentally an idea of exploitation or exploited versus exploited. So the reason certain countries aren't developed is because they've been exploited for the past century or however long you go back exactly. I'm not unclear. Now, there's no doubt that there is a component of that. I mean, there has been exploitation and exploited regions throughout history. And it's certainly true that there are many criticisms to be made about economic institutions as they exist in the world today and who they benefit. However, I don't think this is ultimately a very good explanation of the paradox that we're looking at of why some countries have developed and others haven't. Dependency theory, I don't think can explain relatively high growth, or actually astoundingly high growth in some cases, of many relatively open economies in a short period of time. I've listed some there, some more than others in terms of the level of growth they've had. Another thing, and I've just thrown this sort of table up there, don't worry about every single number here, but if you look at, there are some countries in the world that were never colonized. And often if you compare them to their neighbors, which often have similar kind of geography and other factors, it's sort of not obvious that not being colonized has at least been beneficial in terms of economic performance. I won't go through the details there, you can sort of have a look at that yourself. Obviously, there's many factors that need to be considered when making these sorts of comparisons, and this is just a very crude analysis. But I think the overlying message here, which I think is in 3, is that there's sort of a mistake here about the idea that sustained growth is not really generated by wealth extraction. Many historical cases show this. An example would be the Spanish Empire, which extracted huge quantities of wealth from Latin America in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. And that benefited them for a time, but often much of that wealth was squandered in wars, which in the long run achieved very little for Spain. And they certainly weren't a world leader in industrialization. It didn't lead to prolonged growth and institutional structural change in that society. So I mean, there's other examples of this as well, but I think that dependency in some ways doesn't get at the right, doesn't really get to the question of why structural change happens in some countries but not others. So let's move on to another proposal. I'll just tackle this one briefly. This is the culture explanation. So Max Weber is was a famous proponent of this, but there have been more recent people proposing this idea. Max Weber argued that the Protestant work ethic promotes hard work and saving, and this explains why Northern European countries perform better than Southern European countries, which are more Catholic. And this idea has been expanded to other cultures and differences around the world as well. More modern version is that some cultures are more individualistic, whereas others are more collectivist, and that maybe favors corruption or an in-group bias. An argument has been given, for example, about mafia in southern Italy, or inter-ethnic violence in Nigeria, and preference in government positions and things like that. Sorry, next slide there. So this proposal, there's no doubt that there are cultural differences across regions of the world, and that is going to play a role in the social and economic outcomes in those countries. But again, I don't think this is a very good explanation for the question, to answer the question as to why some regions have succeeded whereas others haven't. Because it's very hard to define culture, and cultures contain many elements, some of which are going to be good for growth and some not. There was a famous debate about Asian values in the 1990s and whether these were pro-growth or not. And the other thing is that economic growth often happens far too quickly when takeoff occurs for cultural change to be a plausible explanation. So I don't think that this is a very good explanation for the question we're seeking. I'll have to speed up because I'm running a bit low on time, but geography is another thing that's been proposed. For example, we do see, and this is still a bit strange just to the extent that this is true, a fairly strong correlation between latitude, which is distance from the equator, and income per capita. You can see a graph of that here. So there's people have pointed to this and said, well, there's something going on with geography here. People propose the idea that navigable rivers, good soil, access to certain resources, or cooler climates may be beneficial for growth. Next slide. Once again, there's certainly some truth to that. Geography obviously matters to some extent, but I mean, I'll put a few question marks on the map here to indicate that whenever someone says this geographic feature is super critical, there's always counterexamples. Botswana being a classic example of a landlocked country that with it's mostly desert. That's actually, I mean, it's not rich, but it's much richer than most of its neighbors. So Botswana's the one in South Africa, if you're not sure. Japan famously has very little arable land and very few natural resources, and it's very wealthy. Switzerland is a canonical example of a case that doesn't make any sense since it's mostly mountains, it's landlocked, it doesn't really have significant natural resources, but it's not very well. So Egypt has, the Nile, which has been very important for people for centuries, but it hasn't been doing so well recently. So there's obviously a lot more going on here than we can explain through geography. And that leads me to the final thing that I wanted to mention, which is institutions. Institutions are hard to define. Something like the rules of the game in society, the way that we shape our interactions with other people. So it's things like the legal system, the educational system, how contracts are enforced, how private property is treated, things like that, as well as the political system. There is a lot of evidence that, and a lot of increasing interest in this, that institutions are in some sense the ultimate, well, ultimate's maybe the wrong word, an underlying reason why some countries perform better than others. So a couple of pieces of evidence here. There are certain natural experiments where countries are sort of split into two for kind of arbitrary reasons, like East and West Germany and North and South Korea, or mainland China versus Taiwan or Hong Kong. And we see massive differences in their economic performance in the space of a few decades. And those are really nice because it's pretty hard to argue that's due to culture or geography. There's also studies looking at migrants to the US, where crossing the US border from Mexico with exactly the same person can like quadruple your expected earnings or something like that. And it's kind of hard to understand what's doing that, apart from, well, higher levels of physical capital is one, but it's also the institutional structure that's very different there. We have a look at the next slide. So there's much more to say about institutions than I can get to here. And there's a lot of debate about exactly which institutions, particularly economic institutions, are sort of critical here. I've listed a few that are discussed in the literature. So protection of property rights is definitely very important. There's a lot of evidence about this. So basically, this is the idea that you're able to accumulate capital and deploy it in productive ways. You don't fear that it's going to be arbitrarily confiscated by the government or a criminal gang or the mob or something like this. And all of these come in degrees, right? It's not a question of it is or it isn't, but there's varying gradations. And even improving from an example being in China right now, where protection of property rights and enforcement of contracts and the legal system, it's not amazing, but under Mao Zedong's regime, which is what was in place a few decades ago, it was about as bad as it could get. And what seems to have happened in China is it went from as bad as it could get to, kind of okay in some ways. And even that has led to, among other factors, of course, a massive improvement in their economic performance. Yes, and so there's a few other factors here, but I'll leave that for you to have a look at. So let me just say in 10 seconds, what does this mean for EA? Well, there's already a lot of work on economic growth and development, but I think that there's more need, particularly for interdisciplinary work. And I think EAs can bring out a unique combination of skills and insights and focus on outcomes and effectiveness to do work in this area at a research angle, or maybe other ways as well. And maybe that's something we can chat about. And so if you can just jump to my final slide where I show a few book recommendations. Not that one. Yeah, sorry, I didn't have time to move that one, but you can Google these if you like. So this is some of the books that I based my presentation on. Sorry, we didn't have time for questions. I ran a bit longer, but I'll be hanging around for a bit if you want to chat with me about anything. So thanks very much, everyone. I appreciate your attention and hope you found it interesting.